This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hannam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we have a really great show today. There's a lot of news to cover, a lot of things going on as usual, but we're going to cover a couple of important topics. One having to do with the fact that US lobbyists failed to disclose the NSO group's ties to Israel. That's the group, by the way, that is responsible in part for this Pegasus software that has been basically, tracking people and responsible for a lot of really problematic things, including being connected to the death of Jamal Khashoggi and being able to tap into the phones of other, high-ranking individuals. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. We're also going to be talking about the trial that's going to begin for an ex-Twitter employee accused of spying for the Saudis. That's a very interesting story that we're going to be covering. But
so before we get two spy stories we have.
I know. Well, these are big spy stories, and they're always connected to what's going on in the Arab world and with the apartheid state. But before we get to that, Jamal, you did a really excellent interview with Giovanni Fassina. He's the program director for the European Legal Support Center. He's going to talk about Deutsche Welle, DW, the German public state-owned international broadcasting company that's been purging and has in fact purged 5 Arab journalists based on accusations. And it looks like obviously false accusations of anti-Semitism in their reporting. They've all sought legal recourse. One is already decided in favor of one of the journalists. It's a big, big story in Germany, and there's a lot of things to talk about with that story. So we got a really great show today.
That's right, Jess. And this is a systematic campaign in Germany, but also by several European countries to, again, as we've seen right here in the United States, to silence critics of the apartheid state of Israel and impose certain sanctions and conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. So let's watch Giovanni. Deutsche Welle, or DW, the German public state-owned international broadcaster, touts its mission as one supporting free media, free expression, and free societies. News coverage of Palestine appears to be exempt from this. In February, there was a purge of 5 Arab journalists based on accusations of anti-Semitism in their reporting. All have sought legal recourse, with one case decision already in favor of one of the journalists. Has the blanket accusation of anti-Semitism become the go-to trigger to censor legitimate discussion on issues related to Palestine? Joining us to discuss this and more, Giovanni Fassina. Giovanni is a lawyer and the program director of the European Legal Support Center. It's the first and only independent organization defending and empowering the Palestine solidarity movement in Europe through legal means. Giovanni specializes in international law and human rights. Welcome to Arab Talk, Giovanni.
Thank you, Jamal. Thank you for inviting me.
Let me begin by asking you, to tell us about the purge of 5 Arab journalists from Deutsche Welle in February based on charges of anti-Semitism. What initiated this?
Well, first of all, there is a background in a sense that already in May 2021, Deutsche Welle censored an interview with Palestinian-American journalist Ali Abu Nimia and eventually apologized for inviting him. And following that incident, Deutsche Welle sent to their staff an internal memorandum banning its employee from using words such as apartheid and colonialism to describe Israel and pushing to use the IHRA definition of antisemitism as a reference. So this is in general background. What triggered this purge was an article published by Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is a newspaper in Germany, where journalist Moritz Baumsteiger went through some of the social media account of journalists working for Deutsche Welle, and he decontextualized and misconstructed some of the articles and social media posts. They were written in Arabic, and framed them as anti-Semitic. Of course, this kind of accusation in Germany, given the context, are extremely serious. Therefore, after publishing this article, Deutsche Welle decided to recruit an external investigator for investigating anti-Semitism within Deutsche Welle. And then, the rest is known, in a sense that after this investigation, all the journalists who were mentioned in this article by Süddeutsche Zeitung, they were all dismissed.
You're talking about the investigator. Is that, are you speaking about Ahmed Mansour, a Palestinian German, I guess, psychologist?
Yes.
He was commissioned by Deutsche Welle to investigate these charges.
Yes, exactly.
What do you know about him?
I don't know much about him. Actually, when we approached the case for the first time, I was hearing about him. We know indeed that he's a Palestinian, that identifies himself as an Israeli Arab, expert in Muslim extremism and anti-Semitism prevention. He has a consultancy firm, which is called Mind Prevention, which was indeed recruited by Deutsche Welle for carrying out this investigation. I don't know much about him, but the report that eventually published was extremely problematic, in our opinion, in a sense that that included a complete misrepresentation of many of the social media posts that were made, and especially it framed as anti-Semitic many statements that actually are protected by freedom of speech. For instance, the report they made, just to give an example, but we could speak about the report for just 1 hour. But in this report, they wrote that of course, like some of the journalists were anti-Semitic, but also some of the partners, organization Deutsche Welle, were anti-Semitic. They're referring are extremely renowned human rights organizations such as AMLE. And they said that, for instance, the fact that Deutsche Welle in Palestine were using the hashtag Save Sheikh Jarrah was following a subjective Palestinian propaganda and was inappropriate, saying that, saying save Sheikh Jarrah could be kind of anti-Semitic. So this just to give an example on how problematic was the report that this person made.
So one of the journalists, Maram Salem, was completely exonerated by these fallacious charges in early July in a court in Bonn. What were the court's findings? Like, just a summary.
Yeah, but first of all, it's important to stress that Maram was assisted by an amazing lawyer, and his name is Ahmed Abed, who is a German-Palestinian lawyer who has been on the front on this kind of cases in Germany. And basically, in this case, what happened was that Maram was dismissed without even knowing the reasons why. They never came to her saying what you said was nothing. She was just dismissed like this. And she found out for the first time in court that they identified some social media posts that she wrote were apparently anti-Semitic, but all her social media posts they were just criticizing Europe and the way and the fact that indeed criticizing Israel in Europe is extremely dangerous because people can face severe repercussions. And basically the judge acknowledged very openly that nothing of what she wrote was anti-Semitic. And therefore, and the Deutsche Welle lawyers which were present there didn't dare to rebut this. So the judge acknowledged that her dismissal is illegal, and right now and now we're waiting Deutsche Welle for appealing this decision, because we think that they're going to appeal anyway, even if they didn't rebut to the final decision of the judge, and their case is based on really weak arguments and weak legs, I would say.
I mean, in Europe, voters or citizens can criticize any politician, pretty much so. I've heard criticism calling politicians fascist and other harsher accusations, but then when you criticize Israel, you're labeled as an anti-Semite. Let's talk about the hypocrisy that Deutsche Welle touts, when they talk about in their motto, freedom of speech, but it's obvious that it is a selective freedom, wouldn't you say?
Yes, especially in the light of the German context. Yes, this is true. But I would say that yeah, this is extremely problematic, especially for organizations that theory defend freedom of speech. But this, in my opinion, is the outcome of years of pressure from pro-Israel groups in Europe. In the last years, many groups push European institutions and governments to adopt a new definition of antisemitism, which is called IHRA definition of antisemitism, which includes many examples where the conflation between anti-Zionism and antisemitism is evident, in a sense that when you're criticizing when you are stating that Israel is an apartheid state and is racist, this can be labeled as anti-Semitic. And this definition has been adopted as non-legally binding, but de facto is creating a policy within institutions, a policy that is paving the way for this conflation and is making more and more difficult to criticize freely the state of Israel. And this case, it's a perfect example of this, in a sense that in the final report that Mansour wrote, the main recommendation was you have to adopt the IHRA definition of antisemitism, and you have to make sure the IHRA is going to be enshrined in all your policies, so you can sanction preemptively any form of speech which can be on the edge of antisemitism. So yeah, it's extremely hypocritical and is becoming more and more a problem. Of course, more in Germany and Austria, I would say, but in general, also in the UK, this is really an issue.
Farah Maraka, Palestinian Jordanian, and another of the journalists that the European Legal Support Center is representing, is awaiting her court date. Discuss her case, please. If I know it's upcoming.
Yeah, I mean, in Farah, the case was slightly different in a sense that case of Maram, indeed, the case of Maram was not even quoted by Mansour in a report, while some of the so Farah is being accused because she wrote some articles back in 2014 and 2015. And were long pieces, which were satirical pieces written in Arabic, which has been badly translated and taken out of context. And Menon was accused of anti-Semitism. And in this case, the lawyer of Farah's argued in court that, first of all, articles that had been written by Farah before being employed by Deutsche Welle cannot be a reason for terminating her contract, because this would be a retroactive application of her contract that doesn't make any sense from a legal point of view. In this case, we decided, the lawyer decided, rightfully so, to defend her on a procedural ground, which make her case really, really strong. And actually, the judge proposed the parties to settle, and Farah accepted to settle only if some conditions were met, and most importantly, if some condition regarding having her reputation rehabilitated. So the judge was in favor of the condition that Farah laid down, and now they are negotiating with Deutsche Welle. If the party won't find an agreement, on the 5th of September, there's going to be a final verdict on the case. Again, it's important to note that also here, in this case, the defense of Deutsche Welle were extremely weak, which show us that the decision to dismiss their employee was based on, indeed, on these huge smear campaigns, which created pressure on the institution, who decided to dismiss these people without even thinking, without having, I think, a legal counsel checking, because if now we have courts deeming illegal and unlawful all this dismissal, it's really a worrying sign, I think.
These cases are part of an obvious broader trend in Germany and across Europe, in fact, to silence Palestinian and anti-colonial voices from public debate. In addition to legal support, such as your organization, what is the political dimension of this?
The political dimension is that in Germany, it's extremely difficult to be a Palestinian and to speak out about Palestine. And we have so many cases which are testifying that are testifying this. So the political dimension is that indeed Palestinian or also Arab with Palestinian background, they are facing more and more challenges to share their own experience and speak about their culture and their past of their families. We have so many cases of censorship. I mean, again, we can have just a session speaking about them, but just to quote a few cases. For instance, in 2019, the German Bundestag adopted a motion called anti-BDS motion, which is a non-legally binding motion adopted by the parties. So it's not law, it's not legally binding. But this motion was equating BDS with anti-Semitism and was calling for public institutions to not provide rooms and services to groups connected with BDS. So the situation now in Germany is that if you, I mean, you just need to be accused of being part of BDS for being accused of anti-Semitism, and this has been challenged in court and extremely successfully by many groups. In the last year, we had at least 6-7 judgments in cases where activists were trying to obtain a room for organizing an event. They were accused of being BDS. And then we're going to court, and the court always acknowledged that this motion is not legally binding, and if implemented in this way, violates fundamental rights. So it's important to recall that there is a very important, because these motions, we have a Bundestag motion adopted at national level, and this motion has been adopted at local level. So we have specific city, municipality, and regions who adopted similar motions. Just want to recall on this that there is a very important case right now in Berlin, which is called BT3P, Bundestag Free for Palestine, where three activists decided to challenge legally before an administrative court the Bundestag motion. The activists are represented always by Ahmed Abed, and we are supporting them as well. These activists lost the first instance, but now there is an appeal where, again, we are trying to have a court acknowledging that the motion per se is unlawful. So again, the political dimension is that there's clearly a climate of repression on the one side. On the other side, again, public and legal mobilization are showing that it's actually possible to fight and to push back against this form of repression.
Do you find it ironic that by repressing Palestinian voices regarding Israeli apartheid and the occupation, Germany is in fact once again facilitating fascist behavior similar to that perpetrated in World War II and wants to atone for?
Yeah, I mean, of course, for me, it's a shame that censorship and surveillance practices remain in Germany. Especially, it's clearly a shame. And there are many important academics and scholars who are now discussing this topic. One of the scholars is Anna Esther Younes, that actually we are also representing, who has been actually victim of a case of surveillance. Just to give you another example, in her case, we have an organization which is called RIAS, which is monitoring anti-Semitism and using anti-Semitism. We're using, the IHRA definition for monitoring anti-Semitic activities. Anna was invited to have a speech in a panel about anti-racism in Berlin by Die Linke, and the day after she was disinvited by her by the organizer. And a few weeks later, she realized that she was disinvited because the organizer received a secret dossier by RIAS. So this organization called RIAS made a secret dossier about Anna, where they were taking her academic publication and some of the social media posts. They created this dossier, and they framed her basically as a racist, as anti-Semitic, and a supporter of Hamas, for instance. And this is digital surveillance. Looking to what people are posting on Facebook, on social media, and creating a dossier is a surveillance. Long story short, Anna sued RIAS in court before the Data Protection Authority for violation of privacy, and won. But the case is still ongoing. So this is extremely worrying. This kind of surveillance practices, of course, are extremely problematic, I would say. But again, also Anna, like Maram, like Farah, has been extremely brave, because deciding to speak out publicly and challenging the thing in court and in the public arena is remarkable, given the huge reputational risk that people can face even by speaking out.
Within the past couple of years or so, as you are aware of, the United Nations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Israel's own human rights organization, B'Tselem, and others have defined Israel as an apartheid state. I mean, it's no longer a secret when you have major organizations now making that definition. Do you think this has any effect on maybe changing the positions of these governments, or are they digging their heels down and just deciding to bury their heads in the sand and ignore these facts?
But I think that the kind of repression we are witnessing now is exactly the direct effect of this narrative, in a sense that governments and governments, but also private and public institutions, are fully aware of what can happen if this narrative becomes slowly hegemonic. And that's why we have this form of repression and surveillance, in a sense that and this, I would say, the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs and pro-Israeli groups are fully aware that if they manage to shut down the debate in Europe, the practices and the policies which are discriminatory that Israel is carrying out in Palestine, then they can continue very easily. So the goal, of course, is to shut down the debate. Mm-hmm. In Europe, the situation is quite complicated, in a sense that it's not an homogeneous situation. Like in each state, in each country, have different positions, I would say, on the apartheid. However, what is important is indeed that when we see, I mean, what we are witnessing is that there is more and more public engagement on this topic, and there is more and more indignations against Israeli practices. So I think that state and institution, like in this case, like Deutsche Welle, will stop the repression when there's going to be when we reach a broader consensus on this, and when again this narrative will become hegemonic. But on this we're confident, because the story is on our side, so we will keep going.
What is the prognosis for the struggle for freedom of speech in Germany in particular, and the EU at large? I mean, if we're silencing, I mean, we're kind of cherry picking one topic, which is the Palestine issue. It still touches on freedom of speech. So the European Union or Europe at large cannot claim to have freedom of speech, right?
Yeah. But first of all, I mean, it's also very interesting in the sense that the culture that we have in Europe on freedom of speech is slightly different from what you have in the United States. Also because in Europe, especially, and I come from Italy, like the freedom of speech was always used, especially after the Second World War, by neo-fascist group in order to claim their space in the democratic arena. So for me, this is not only a matter of freedom of speech, it's a matter of accountability. If we want to make Israel accountable, we need to be able to speak about first. Second is a matter of right now is a matter of discrimination. I think that public and private institutions cannot discriminate and silence Palestinian or people speaking out for Palestinian rights based indeed on the origin of the Palestinian and based on their past and what they were recounting. So these are two important things. The problem is, of course, again, like Gramsci used to say, the optimism of the will, the pessimism of the rational. Of course, I remain optimism in a sense that in the last 4 years, we've obtained many crucial victories in court. Now, we have European Court of Human Rights, which is the European Court of Human Rights is a European court which judgments are legally binding in all the 27 in the State of Council of Europe. And there is a judgment in 2020, Baldassi versus France, in a case where BDS activists were sanctioned and were convicted for racial discrimination, and the court acknowledged that their conviction was a violation of freedom of expression, clearly acknowledging that the call for boycotting Israel is not a discriminatory call. We have this positive judgment. In Germany, we have other 7 judgments against anti-BDS motions. So of course, like we are laying the ground slowly for defying these repressive tactics. On the other side, we are also very aware that justice won't be delivered by a court. Like a court can issue judgment that can be yes important, but justice is made eventually by the people, and people should just. Yeah,
that's actually a good segue, because my next question was to ask you. I mean, you talk about the legal court and giving these examples, but how are you doing in the public court?
Well, I mean, just to give you a few examples, in the public
or public opinion, I should say, public opinion.
In the public, again, we could speak another hour about this, because public opinion completely differs country by country. I would say is situation in the Netherlands is different from Germany and in the UK. But just so you, I mean, during the bombing on Gaza in 2021, there were huge demonstrations, huge in the Netherlands, in Germany, in the UK. In the UK, in London, we had 100 or 200,000 people demonstrating in the street. So the public opinion is more careful about these things, I think. And just to give an example, like in Germany, just yesterday, during this weekend, there was the Berlin Pride in Germany, the anti-capitalist Berlin Pride, which for many years was organized by leftist organization in Germany, which actually were very pro-Israeli. In the last 3 years, now the anti-capitalist Pride, which is a huge demonstration, there are thousands of people, has a huge Palestinian queer bloc and many Palestinian flags. While the so-called anti-Deutsche, this left, pro-Israeli left group, they were now excluded from the group, which is a small sign, because we're talking about really like small groups. But in my opinion, it's still symptomatic on how the discourse is slowly changing. Again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but again, for the work we do, for us, the most important thing is that people that are attacked cannot be left alone. And that's for us the most important thing, because eventually we want to empower activists, empower individuals who are advocating for Palestinian rights, and make sure that they are properly defended and represented when they are affected by this kind of attacks.
Well, Giovanni, it seems that you yourself and, of course, the European Legal Support Center are doing a great job, and I mean, it's very much needed to be a defense and a voice for the voiceless. Giovanni Fassina, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Thank you so much to you. And just want to close that, thank you so much for your kind words. We've been extremely inspired by the amazing work that also the United States Palestine Legal and Center for Constitutional Rights are doing. So if you're here now, it's because we had really good models we are following. Thanks for inviting me again.
My pleasure.
That's the voice and the face of Giovanni Fassina. Jamal, it's a very interesting interview that you did with Giovanni. I mean, I think as we mentioned on the intro, and we've certainly been talking about it, there's been renewed attacks on individuals, journalists, and anybody who's been critical of the apartheid state and conflating criticism of the apartheid state, which is justifiable, with anti-Semitism. And this is a pretty big case having to do with these journalists, one of whom has been vindicated.
That's right. And something very interesting that Giovanni said in the interview, Jess, and it didn't, actually he just hit the nail right on the head. Because I asked him, I said, look, I mean, the landscape has been changing. Israel has been found to be an apartheid state by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, by the United Nations, so many organizations, including its own former Attorney General. And you'll think, these countries who claim to be democratic countries in Europe will say, wait a minute, it's legitimate to criticize apartheid, isn't it? Wasn't it the case to criticize apartheid South Africa?
Absolutely.
And what he said was very important. He said, no, they're basically upping the ante because they're trying to preempt, because they think that if that label, which sticks, the apartheid label, which in my opinion, your opinion, many people, it has already been there. But if that label sticks, then they have an uphill battle. So they're working harder to delegitimize organizations, to delegitimize journalists, to delegitimize politicians, anyone who basically criticizes Israel.
Well, Jamal, I think this is going to be yet another example of the Hasbaristas and the defenders of apartheid Israel who have overplayed their hand again, because in fact, it's not just that the label of apartheid Israel is sticking. The reality of apartheid Israel is becoming more and more apparent to the entire world, to world leaders, and to governments. And so, as we found out with the BDS movement, when the apartheid regime finds itself kind of losing the public relations battle and the truth battle on these issues, they just up the ante. They will never apologize. They will never come clean. They will never acknowledge that they are an apartheid regime. So what they do is that they go on the attack. So the attack of these 5 journalists, one of whom has been vindicated, I guess is proof of what we've been saying. When they begin to feel the heat, they double down.
Exactly. That's what's going on. And we're seeing it right here, of course, on college campuses in the United States. And we're seeing it now with the midterm elections, how much AIPAC and its surrogates, they have been pouring millions.
Look at Donna Edwards was another great example.
Yes, I was going to add him to our show, but we don't have the time to discuss it. We'll discuss it next week because there'll be other examples. But talking about $6 million, Jess, in a congressional in a congressional district.
Unbelievable.
Basically, that's the number. That's the figure. Versus, I think J Street invested $100,000 or $80,000 in the opponent's campaign. I mean, this is how important and how big it is for them to stack up Congress with pro-Israel candidates.
That's exactly right, Jamal. We'll be following this story because the pre-midterm elections, we have a lot of early elections going on right now. The Donna Edwards example is a really important one. We don't have time to talk about it today, but the apartheid regime, their apologists here in DC, whether it's AIPAC or other institutions, are pouring in tens of millions of dollars. And it's both Democrat and Republican. It's just they're pouring in money to confront anybody who's critical of the apartheid regime. So obviously we'll be following that story. That story from Germany represents, what's happening in Europe, of course, which is very similar to here. So we'll continue to follow this story.
That's right. So moving on, Jess, U.S. lobbyists accused of failing to disclose NSO groups, and as you've said, they're responsible for the spyware Pegasus, ties to the Israeli government. And I mean, how do you fail to disclose ties to a foreign entity or a foreign government in this case? So there is a complaint, and if this complaints are, confirmed, each lobbyist could face up to 5 years in prison and a fine of $250,000.
Wow.
So the organization, we've had actually the executive director hosted on the show before for this organization, but it's the Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN. In a letter they sent to the U.S. Department of Justice, calling on the government just to investigate the 4 agents representing NSO, saying that when the agents registered themselves under FARA, they stated that the freedom of information. They stated that the company was not supervised, owned, directed, controlled, financed, or subsidized in part by any foreign government. And these
complete lie.
These 3
complete
lobbyists, for the record, who are now facing this lawsuit, David Tamasi, Steve Rabinowitz, and Timothy Dickinson, they had filed to register for the NSO group after it was placed. This happened after it was placed on a blacklist by the U.S. Department of Commerce. So this is after actually everyone knew what NSO is all about last year. Another lobbyist, his name is Brian Finch, registered prior to the listing. So I guess he was not, named. I'm not sure. I have to look at the details. In the lawsuit, and the complaint says, this is just I'm quoting from here, and on the form it says the possession or exercise of power directly or indirectly to determine the policies or the activities of a person, whether through the ownership of voting rights by contract or otherwise. Meaning, if a government exerts this, then you have to declare that, this organization is, the government of France is behind it, or government of Britain is behind it, government of Israel is behind it. So in a report from the New York Times, senior Israeli officials said that the Israeli government considered NSO and this software company a crucial component of its foreign policy, and that if the U.S. accused it of acting against Washington interests, then it was implicitly accusing Israel of doing the same.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Everybody knows this, Jamal. Everybody knows that the NSO group works hand in hand, not just in terms of coordinating their efforts, but sharing of information with the apartheid regime. And listen, Pegasus has caused the death of many people because governments like the Saudi regime and other regimes,
including possibly Jamal Khashoggi.
Yeah, including possibly Jamal Khashoggi. But, I think the reporting on that is pretty compelling, that his phone was infected with Pegasus software. Lots of politicians and other people have had their phones infected with this, including, it appears to be, some Americans and some American politicians. So this is well known about Pegasus, Jamal, and the NSO group. And yet they get away with it, and they continue to get away with it. And I don't know, maybe I'm just not as optimistic, but with this filing, maybe there'll be some accountability, but only time will tell.
Well, I mean, listen, there were several investigations into this, mostly in 2021. This is when the NSO story sparked international outrage. And it showed how Pegasus, the Israeli company's flagship product, that's their flag, was used, as you mentioned, by governments to spy on activists, journalists, and political dissidents. Not only by the Israeli government, which is, it seems to me, the backbone of this organization, but also by oppressive regimes like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco. They've been using this spyware to track political dissidents outside their countries and inside their countries. It's not a secret. It's not
a secret.
It's not a big secret. And I know, we've been talking about this, and you always made the joke and kind of like you said, well, U.S. politicians should inspect their phones, kind of like you should
absolutely
check.
Absolutely.
But no one is really taking this seriously right here in the United States, because aside, which we know Saudi Arabia has used this product and all these, regimes, we know for sure, I mean, I'm sure that several US politicians, all their information has been taken away from their communication devices by this product, and someone is keeping the lid on this.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jamal. And I have
we're not talking about like as if this has never, like maybe people think that we suffer from short-term memory and the name Jonathan Pollard disappeared from our memory. The largest basically spying case on the US government by any individual in recent history. So Israel has this history. So the question is that we always pose, how much of this spying has been done through Pegasus on American political
I have
figures?
It's a good question, Jamal. I have some speculation. I suspect that the United States' own intelligence services have been using Pegasus also. And it wouldn't surprise me if AIPAC and its surrogates are using Pegasus. And I'm just saying, because we have to ask the question, in whose interest is it to protect the NSO group and the use of Pegasus software? And the reason that they're not coming down harder on the NSO group and the accountability for not disclosing this, it may have to do with the US intelligence services liking this particular software because they're able to use it. I'm speculating, of course. I don't have the data to prove it yet, but 1 + 1 in my mind is still 2. And the fact that they haven't been held accountable and it has been used so widely makes me very suspicious.
And the other issue that we've always raised on this show is how come these lobby groups like AIPAC and others are not registered as foreign agent? And this is
absolutely
a prime example of this. And by the way, last month, a group of bipartisan lawmakers introduced a bill that would impose lifetime ban on members of Congress, senior military leaders, and senior executive branch officials from lobbying for a foreign government or a political party. Yet you have all these AIPAC stooges running around in Washington, D.C., lobbying on behalf of Israel, affecting our elections right here in the United States, going after critics of Israel in Congress, and they are not registered as a foreign agent. And then you have these 3 lobbyists, or maybe more, who watch this and say, well, they get away with it. We can lobby on behalf of this spyware company and not say that the Israeli government is behind it and get away with it.
That's exactly right, Jamal. And this is why it's such a big story, And that's why I know we're going to be following this story. And I really do believe there's a darker side to this story, which will eventually come out, having to do with the complicity between NSO intelligence services here, maybe in other countries, that are pushing back on the accountability of these things. And I guess it's okay to be a lobbyist for an apartheid regime, but if you're doing it for other countries, like there's a big story, we don't have time to cover it today, but there was someone who was held accountable, an American citizen, who was who's going to be investigated for being who failed to disclose his lobbying for Qatar and for the UAE. That's another big story. Again, we may report on it next week. It'll just depend, but that's going to be, they'll hold those individuals accountable. But when it comes to AIPAC and these other individuals, they get away, as we've said, literally and figuratively with murder.
Well, those who get away with murder, such as MBS, and that's kind of a segue to our next story.
Exactly.
Yes, and talking about Saudi Arabia, the medieval kingdom. We talked about the apartheid regime. Now we're going to talk about the medieval kingdom. This Thursday, the trial began right here, just in San Francisco, for Ahmed Abu Ammo, a former Twitter employee accused of spying on users on behalf of Saudi Arabia.
Unbelievable.
In 2019, Mr. Abu Ammo was arrested and charged with committing wire fraud and acting as an agent of a foreign government without disclosing that work. And in the opening statement in the San Francisco Federal Court, the Justice Department described Mr. Abu Ammo as an agent of Saudi Arabia who had used his internal access to dig up the personal information of dissidents of the regime on Twitter. And he wanted money and proximity to power. That's according to the prosecutors. And he had a close and still maintains a close relationship with Badr bin Askar, who was a top advisor of the Crown Prince, MBS. So all roads lead to MBS.
What a surprise. What a surprise.
So they displayed his photo of Mr. Abu Ammo and Mr. bin Askar standing in front of a wooden sculpture of the Twitter logo during the tour of the company in San Francisco's headquarters. They met in London, and you and I don't have a luxury watch. Mr. Abu Ammo received a luxury watch. I can guess what kind of a watch it is.
You could. I mean, this is part of the pattern and the practice, Jamal, of certain people with money and access to the super wealthy and connected and powerful, like MBS, are able to weasel their way into Twitter and to these other companies and spy on people who are critical of the apartheid regime and dig up personal information. I mean, it's such an obvious case. And for the US to take this step and to file this complaint and to have it go to trial, this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's happening and what's going on out there. But, I guess you said it, and the moral of the story is, and Joe Biden learned this moral, Jamal, all roads go to MBS, full stop. Whether it's the killing of Jamal Khashoggi or deploying Saudi assets within the United States to spy on people who are critical of the medieval kingdom. So it's a pretty ugly story.
Well, think about it, how powerful these tools and these agents and the services they are providing to oppressive regimes like Saudi Arabia or to countries like Israel. I mean, when you have Pegasus, that can be installed on your computer and your phone and so forth, spying on these dissidents, and then you have basically moles working inside Twitter
at a very high level.
At a very high level.
Very high level.
And this just names Twitter. So if they are at Twitter, wouldn't they be at Facebook, Instagram,
TikTok,
you name it? So,
everywhere.
I mean, basically, these governments and companies are subjecting anyone who is a critic of a certain oppressive regime to be tracked, to be spied on, and eventually this could lead to their arrest, or in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, to their murder.
That's exactly right, Jamal. And that speaks to me, this larger story. Why isn't Meta and Facebook and Twitter, why are they not being held accountable? At the larger level, in terms of legislation and in terms of being able to put some sort of guardrails around the misuse of personal identifying information around these mega conglomerate internet corporations. And the reason is somebody is benefiting that has a lot of money and a lot of power. And these companies are going to be allowed to function without any law or without any guardrails or without any protection, because somebody is benefiting. And we know that MBS is benefiting from this. We know that the apartheid regime is benefiting. I suspect there are others who are benefiting too.
Well, they're busy basically silencing Palestinian voices, silencing critics of Israel. I mean, that's what we have witnessed, you and I, what's going on Facebook and basically shutting down Palestinian pages, while from within they have basically moles working on behalf of foreign governments. I mean, I feel that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and
so, yeah.
Hopefully someone who's honest enough, who's basically ambitious enough to start an investigation of all these companies to make sure that they don't have moles servicing foreign countries.
I think it's pretty much guaranteed, and I'm willing to stake everything on this, Jamal, that each one of these companies has moles. So we shall see, right? We shall see. And we need a January 6th style commission and committee investigating these mega digital internet companies to see what other foreign interests are acting as moles. We are going to keep following this story. That's what I know for sure.
Well, the moral of the story, watch out for foreign agents who are not registered as such, and watch out for moles at Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms.
100%.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download our shows from there, and we will talk to you next week.
See you next week.